Hi, welcome to another Film File. I'm Lee Ford,
And I'm Andy Meakin.
and it's grand to be back. In this week, we are particularly grand because, hey, you can just go and hug apparently anybody you want in the street and no one will complain. But most importantly, the cinemas are open. Insert right here triumphant music. This week's deep dive ties in to this week's episode number. It is, of course, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure is a science fiction comedy film series created by Ed Solomon and Chris Matheson. Chris Matheson, by the way, the son of the great Richard Matheson. Starring as William Bill S. Preston Esquire and as Ted Theodore Logan are Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves, respectively. Two metalhead slacker friends who travel through time and, in the second film, go to hell. The first film came out in 1989, with the sequel hitting in 1991, and last year we had the third in who knew was going to be a trilogy, Bill and Ted Face the Music, coming out in 2020. The first film introduces us to Bill and Ted, who are trying to write a history project. Rufus, a guide from the year 2688, arrives back in time to provide them with a time machine which allows them to travel back in time and meet historical figures in order to learn about key historical events. If Bill and Ted fail to pass, the teacher will have to flunk them, and Ted's father will transfer him to an Alaskan military academy, which will end the promising career of a band called Wild Stallions from never forming and in turn destroying a utopian future built around their music. I first saw this film, I think it was probably early 90s, as it had a delayed release due to shenanigans with the studio, and even longer before it got a UK release. I saw this in the States. I'd heard a little bit about it. Keanu Reeves was on the up for his more sort of independent projects, but had that makings of being a big star. As soon as I saw Bill and Ted, I fell in love with the concept and I fell in love with the characters. These two initially idiotic teenagers had so much warmth and charm. And I recognized the need to be in a band, as I'd struggled as well to make my own band successful. And I fell in love with them. And I love them to this day. I know Andy and I differ on the last movie, but I've loved them through all their adventures. Bill and Ted are just fantastically lovable characters, especially played by these two actors, and it's a film series that I just cherish. Andy, when did you first meet Bill and Ted?
I first met them. It was after Bogus Journey had come out at the cinema and gone. I didn't catch it at the cinema. I caught Bogus Journey when that came on home release, and we rented out both the first and second films, because that's why I didn't go to see Bogus Journey on the big screen. I hadn't seen Excellent Adventure. And time travel films generally hold an appeal to me. I'm a huge sci-fi nerd, and I love time travel, and I love the intricacies and the theories of time travel. And I love the fact that this just throws all theories to the wind and breaks its own rules constantly. The rules of time travel are stretched somewhat in this film, but it's all done to create a sense of fun from the start to the joyous ends. The first film, Excellent Adventure, and rewatching it this week, made me realise what it was that I loved about the first two films in particular. The characters, Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan, dumb wannabe rock stars with no brains and pretty little talent, but with this bizarre destiny to bring about universal peace, is such a bizarre concept. And the casting of Winter and Reeves, fantastic. But the casting of Rufus by George Carlin, what a bit of marvelous casting. A minor role, but Carlin is just magnificent within it. But it's an utterly daft film throughout, in a charming kind of way that makes sure the laughs are genuine, and even when at the expense of how idiotic Bill and Ted actually are, it's never mean-spirited laughs. It's always you're laughing along with their antics rather than laughing at how stupid they are. Their dumbness is part of their charm. They have a pure, innocent view of the world, like a childlike view, that they don't see the negativity. They just take everything as it is. And Winter and Reeves play into that thoroughly. Their very demeanor and facial expressions, when they're not even the focus of the scene, when they're just sided off as someone else is doing stuff, shows all their innocence and their wonder in the spectacle that they're part of. That's the true joy of it. It's their reacting to the events as opposed to being a part of them. And you love the characters, and you can kind of understand how they could become a focus for universal peace, because if everyone adopts that childlike viewpoint of the world, we could all live in perfect harmony together. And that's what makes such a dumb comedy something much, much more than what it actually is.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's what kind of has given it its sort of classic quality. You've got the wide-eyed puppy dog looks of both of them, and the they're not smart characters, and they play that all the way through, but they're utterly likable, utterly quotable. I mean, I came back, as I said, I saw this in the US before it hit England, and you were using the word dude and all those expressions, which were kind of vernacular way back in the late 80s, early 90s. But it's the charm of the two leads that carry on. It is a silly film, but it's a silly film that transcends it because it is so just so darn likable. Nobody gets out of it without being silly, and it plays, as you said, and even more so in later films, plays very very roughshody over the ideas of time travel. But we don't care because we just like Bill and Ted so much that I know that you had problems with the third film, but through all their adventures, it's these guys that we just like, and we like to spend time with them. So after the kind of the initial success of Bill and Ted, there was an offshoot animated series in which initially Alex Winter and Keanu Reeves voiced, and was very good. It was that kind of early 90s animation, but it was very good and kept Bill and Ted alive. And then there was also a TV series played by different actors, which was short lived, but that led into a much anticipated sequel, originally known as Bill and Ted Go to Hell. It ended up coming out as Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, in which now Bill and Ted are still struggling with their girlfriends, the princesses that they brought back from the Dark Ages, and Chuck D. Normalos, a resident of the utopia of the future, is sick of it and sends a pair of Bill and Ted robots, doubles, back into the past to kill Bill and Ted, and which he actually does. So Bill and Ted are sent to hell and are faced with the Grim Reaper. Bill and Ted are killed, go to hell, and face the Grim Reaper, but manage to best him at several games, including battleships, in a spoof of the classic Seventh Seal. It's a darn silly film, but again, it's the charm of Bill and Ted, Winter and Reeves, that makes it work. And it also made a big hit out of a Kiss track as well. Did you like Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey?
Oh, I loved Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Both Excellent Adventure and Bogus Journey have a beautiful blend of physical comedy and witty zingers of dialogue that stay with you afterwards. Like you said, there's so many quotable moments from both of those films. And the casting, I mean, in Bogus Journey, De Nomolos played marvellously by Joss Ackland, who was notorious behind the scenes of pretty much anything that he was in, of not really getting what he was part of. And you get the feeling that he just breezed through this, not quite understanding what he was actually involved in. And then you've got the great William Sadler as the Grim Reaper, who becomes a character that you kind of wished had his own offshoot spin-off movie series. He was absolutely brilliant. He gets the physical comedy aspects, him falling from heaven moment when they're brought back to life, always makes me chuckle. But even on the first film, the physical comedy, such as Ted falling down the stairs, and then by the time Bill gets down there, he sees the suit of armor getting impaled. But Ted had just fallen out of the armor. And he's like, what? But, you know, you've got the quotes. I mean, the episode that we're calling this is 69, dude, because 69, dude. Put them in the Iron Maiden. Iron Maiden, excellent. Absolute nonsense, but all quotable stuff. Bogus Journey cleverly didn't focus on time travel too much. Yes, it was someone from the future wanting to change the past, but it was the metaphysical journeys through heaven and hell that this film focused on, and it had a lot of fun doing it, leading up to the Battle of the Bands. That was the second thing that they had to succeed in order for their perfect destiny to happen. And much as like with the first film, the showcase event at the end, the Battle of the Bands at the end of this is another showcase of moments of perfection. You've got the time travel meddling all takes place in there, like, but then I had another gun, and but then there's the cage, but I had the key. And I love that absolute ridiculousness of you are planning future time travel meddling by putting things in place that you can use now. Brilliant. Absolutely destroys my brain every time that I watch it, because I always get too obsessed with time travel in any time travel film, but I love it for it.
Now, we're going to differ on this one.
Like you say, the film then took a couple of decades out. It was rumored and mooted for a couple of decades that there would be another film, but the second film, Bogus Journey, sadly hadn't scored that well box office wise for it to warrant going straight into production. And so in recent years, as in last year, we finally got Face the Music, and I wanted to like this. I really hoped to like it, but when that first trailer landed, that was when I started to get uneasy, because what I worried was that it was just going to be a hodgepodge of fan nostalgia moments. And when it came to watching the film, and we both just talked about it, and we both came at it from different points of view, and I've revisited it this week, and I've still not got any love for it. It is just fan nostalgia moments to me. It does nothing new. It doesn't add anything to the franchise. It's just repeating the comedies, repeating the moments. And generally, it's a film that is entirely forgotten within minutes of the end credits running. Whereas the first two films, I can quote lines of dialogue. When I was watching Excellent Adventure, my daughter was in the room and she kept turning around and said, "Would you stop saying the lines before they happen?" And she's like, "Can't help it." But with Face the Music, I can't even recite one line of dialogue after watching it twice.
You know that I differ on this, but there are points that you're saying that I do agree with. So Bill and Ted Face the Music, which came out last year. So they're now middle-aged parents, yet to realize their musical future and therefore the future of a utopian society that will follow. They're warned by the great leader and Rufus's daughter Kelly from the future. They only have a short amount of time in their present to create the greatest song, or reality will collapse. Bill and Ted decide to travel to the future to try and find their song, but are hunted by a time-traveling robot. Their daughters, Billy and Thea, go about going back in time to try to put together the greatest band of all time. What I liked about it, and I agree with a lot of what you say, I think it's forgettable, especially in light of Face the Music. I like that it was about, I like the fact that they were middle-aged guys who never made it. That they, spoilers, they ended up not writing the greatest song, and they had all this pressure to come back and do something that was great, but they failed at. I love the daughters. I thought Billy and Thea were fantastic, and I would certainly watch a spin-off film starring Billy and Thea. But what I did like about it is it's about creativity, and it's therefore that the future for all of us, what makes a utopian society and makes peace, is that it's creativity and it's music and it's art, and that's what I just warm to because of that. It doesn't quite work in the way that the previous films work. It's always a pleasure to see Keanu and it's always a pleasure to see Keanu Reeves and Alex Winter back on the screen alongside each other, because they have a great repartee, and that works and still works in this movie. But it's that sense that all the evils of the world will be put right by creativity, and for that I applaud it. It's not perfect. Do I love it as much as the previous two? No. I did find it hard work the second time I saw it, but I do like that element. So that's Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure.
It's still better than the live action TV series that you mentioned, which you can track all the episodes down on YouTube, but I urge people not to do this to yourself. It's not worth it. The animated series, by all means, track that down, embrace it, love it. Comic book series, absolutely brilliant. Just don't track down that live action TV series.
If you're enjoying the Film File, then you should subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything. In fact, it's free. It's so free that it is the free guy of podcasts. All you have to do is all you have to do is go to your favorite podcasting platform, hit subscribe, and you'll get the Film File every week delivered straight into your ear holes. And
into your what holes?
Into ear holes. Did I? Ear holes. Should I rephrase that? Or do you want to just leave that?
We'll put it in your arseholes. We'll leave it.
So, as you know, each week we have been delivering a deep dive. And whether we're going to continue with a deep dive, I guess we'll have to wait to see whether we are back into the cinemas. But our deep dive for this week is a British piece of iconography. It came out unbelievably in 1996. It changed British cinema. It made big stars out of its director and out of its leading man. It was everywhere and anywhere. It was the cultural icon of its time. Trainspotting, the black comedy directed by Danny Boyle and starring Ewan McGregor. Where to start with Trainspotting? It was released to critical acclaim, had some backlash even from the government. It's regarded as one of the best British films of the 90s. It's ranked 10th by the British Film Institute in its list of top 100 British films of the 20th century. And in 2004, it was voted the best Scottish film of all time. Though I don't know what it was competing against. And in 2017, a poll of 150 actors, directors, and writers, producers, and critics for Time Out magazine ranked it the 10th best British film ever. And also, there was a sequel, T2, Trainspotting, which was released in January 2017. Trainspotting, when it came out, was everywhere. MTV, because it had the Iggy Pop music video. The style of the poster became a part of the Britpop movement and became that cool Britannia. It was young, it was hip, it was dynamic. We'd never seen anything like it. It was a film of its time, but it's a film that you look back and you still think fabulous. Or do you? Or do you, Andy Meakin?
Yes, you certainly do. I revisited both Trainspotting and Trainspotting 2 this past week and loved them all over again. The first film, adapted from the novel by Irvine Welsh, is a look at a disenfranchised group of 20-somethings who inhabit the world of drug addiction. The film tapped, as you hinted at, perfectly into that era's consciousness of the 90s, even before it released, thanks to an impactful marketing campaign, which saw character posters emblazoned on phone booths, bus stops, any spare space in Sheffield city centre. You saw a character poster, Renton, Diane, Begbie, leaning forwards, giving the V's up, looking cold and wet, whatever poses they were in, with the Trainspotting down the side, and then arrival date, and that was the release date. And you knew from seeing those posters that this was going to be something different. This was something that stands out. You didn't recognise any of the cast except maybe what's his name? Except maybe Robert Carlyle, who was gaining a bit of publicity thanks to his TV roles at that point in time. But Ewan McGregor was pretty much an unknown. And there was also a series of poster images, such as Ewan McGregor climbing out of a toilet, or the infamous Choose Life philosophy, that spoke to folk of a certain age group. And suffice to say, at the age of 23, when the film came out, I was that target age group. I'd flunked university. I was scratching a living on minimum wage in a dead-end job. I clung to nightclubs and drinking, and perhaps a smoke or two, to give my existence some meaning, and Trainspotting spoke to me. Even though I had never been deep into hard narcotics, I'd like to state that here, I've never been down the junkie route, but the culture that it reflected, it was the culture that I could see around me at that age group. McGregor had worked with Danny Boyle on Shallow Grave beforehand, which I'd seen. I was one of about the 5 people in the UK who actually saw that film 2 years earlier. And even though that was a great film, it was Trainspotting that really put him on the map and made him the star that he is today. As the lead voice in the film, Renton, he's the narrator taking us through this world that is exciting, dangerous, melancholy. He goes through the highs, the lows, the overdoses, and more in a very breezy, and I forgot, it's a breezy 90 minutes runtime. It's
Wow,
only
you
when
see,
I
I'd
put it
forgotten
on
that
the
element
other
to
day
it.
that was like, this is actually quite a short film. Absolutely. To get so much of the story, because anyone who's read the book, and I've read the book a few times, will know that it's quite a complex book, and it's quite a hard book to read because it is all told in the tone of voice of each of the characters of the story,
Yeah, it's got a kind of almost a
including the accents.
Clockwork Orangey type way in that there's a certain language to it.
So it was always considered like to be a hard book to adapt to film, but Boyle managed to bring it perfectly to screen. And bearing in mind this was Boyle's second film outing, he put a mark on cinema overall with his style.
I remember it being sold at the time, and it had that same kind of coolness that, well, say Pulp Fiction had, and I know McDonald, one of the producers, tried to sell it that way, especially in the States market. But it did have a cool quality to it. I mean, it had an amazing cast of people who've now gone on to other things all over the place. I mean, Ewan McGregor we talked about. Ewan Bremner has now is a character actor. Johnny Lee Miller went from there, went straight over to Hollywood. Robert Carlyle, as you said. Kelly MacDonald, who's done amazingly well and has just come off our screens with Line of Duty. So it had a fantastic young cast who gave it their all. It was almost like this is going to be the last film that we're ever in, so we'll just be spot on perfect. It then, of course, it launched as any successful British film does, this hope that we were going to have a new reign of British movie making, and a lot of films did follow off the back end of Trainspotting that had a certain influence from it, but nothing did it in the way that Trainspotting did. It hit the nerve um, exactly at the right time, with exactly the right marketing, with exactly the right budget, and with exactly the right cast. Everything is the perfect storm for this one to be released in. While other films, even other films based around uh, the author's other works, just didn't connect. You kind of say you can I'll start that again. You can say almost the same thing of what happened with Tarantino when Tarantino came out. You got a lot of subpar Tarantino-esque films with the occasional good ones that stand out. But it was a moment in time that captured that particular period, that captured that enthusiasm for the whole cool Britannia feel that was going off. You had the rise in Britpop and British music. It was cool to be British. You got the Blair government coming in around the same time. Everything about that was the perfect storm. Um, and it's a film that I've seen many times, and is highly quotable. And it's just the perfect snapshot of that particular period. And when you think back to 1996, as I said before, the timing was absolutely spot on.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fun, genuinely funny. Every time I rewatch it, I forget how genuinely belly laugh funny some of the moments are. It's emotional, it's sharply scripted, it's stylish. Boyle's direction, coupled with Brian Tufano's cinematography, give a unique visual feel with fantastical and sometimes sickening and harrowing images to draw us into the drug-fueled world of Renton and his mates. But it's the music as well. You've already said like the cast, everything was perfect, but the music is so perfectly placed. This film has some of the best needle drops ever committed to film that you can get. Even now, if Iggy Pop's Lust for Life starts, I already have going through my head, choose life, choose a job,
Yeah.
choose a family. If Perfect Day comes on, I feel myself sinking into a carpet. Yeah, it's all every tune that is used within this. Blondie's Atomic. You can
Yeah, which was done
remember
by
the
Sleeper, if I
moment in the
remember. Yeah.
film. Yeah,
Because
and
they
you
tied
can
into it. They tied
get
into what was
drawn
going
into the
on.
absolute perfect use of the best music around. And, you know, it made Underworld's Born Slippy actually be a hit, which that takes some achievement because they didn't really do much after that. By the close of Trainspotting, it was one of those films that even though it told so much story, you got to the end and you thought, oh, I want to know what happened to these people next. Because you fell in love with the characters. The characters felt so real. You wanted to know, where did Renton go at the end? What happened to Begbie? What happened to Spud? What happened to Sick Boy? Did Renton get back with Diane or what? And answers to those initially came via the follow-up novel Porno. But for then, the film incarnations would arrive 20 years later, as you've said, when T2, Trainspotting, got released. I remember reading an interview in the early part of the 2000s with Danny Boyle when he was asked, was he going to look at doing a sequel to Trainspotting? And he said that he'd love to do it, and he'd love to set it like 10, 15 years after the first film. But I'm not going to use his exact word, but he called them some unquotable names. All refused to get old. And he was basically referring to the fact that all of his cast from this film didn't age. You look at them and you just go, yeah, you can't play someone 15 years on when you only look 2 days on from when you were in the film. So he wanted to wait until they looked like they'd grown up a bit and to be able to give a reason to tap back into their lives. And when T2 came out, it got a very mixed reaction from people who were expecting one kind of film because it delivered something completely different to what Trainspotting was.
It did. I mean, to get there, as you've said, Ewan McGregor had to, buddy up to Danny Boyle. They'd fallen out over casting decisions for The Beach. It didn't look for a long time that they would ever work together, and they needed to. They needed to resolve those differences, and they did. And they held meetings saying, they would work together again, and they did. I like Trainspotting too. Now, I like it, but I don't go back to it. I enjoyed the movie that I saw. It didn't disgrace the original, but what it lacked was that urgency. Again, because that urgency was made by people in their 20s, and now people in their 40s upwards don't have that sense of urgency that was in 1996. So there's a lot of elements that I did. I like the fact that it took a different route. It dealt with middle-aged. It dealt with the fact of having been somebody and what that means, and the legacy of having been somebody, and what you're going to do for the future when the future still, even in your later years, can be uncertain. There was lots and lots of elements that I liked about it, but it didn't have, and this was always going to be the problem with T2. It didn't have that knockout effect that the original Trainspotting did. It's a very good film with a great cast that talks about some interesting ideas, and while not strictly an adaptation of Porno, it does have a lot to say, and it has a lot to say for the generation who've grown up since then.
Yeah, the original film in the 90s reflected the mindset of the mid-20s youth, lost for direction, trying to find themselves. T2 reflected the mindset of your late 40s, you're approaching middle age, reflecting on missed opportunities, past mistakes. And again, I was the age group perfectly placed for that film. I'd got to that stage in my life where I kind of had a direction, but I wasn't sure if I was going in the right direction. And as you know well, is only a year later, I moved on from where I was stable in an employment and took a risk and moved on to something else because I was at that age where I was questioning things, where I was starting to wonder, was this what I wanted to do with my life? T2 tapped into me completely. And rewatching it, you say that it's not one that you go back to, and it wasn't for me until this week when I rewatched it and I suddenly got it all over again. And now I think it's going to be constantly, whenever I revisit Terminator, whenever I revisit Trainspotting, I'm going to go straight onto T2 straight afterwards because I think they bookend each other beautifully. What I found interesting with T2 is that it made me look back at the character of Spud a lot more, because in the first film, he was a very slight character, he was comic relief, but he was a bit of a pitiful character. But you now see that he was the actual heart of that group
Yeah,
that
I agree
held them
with that.
together. Because T2 focused a lot on how he never got out of that drug addiction, because without Renton there to show him he saw Renton as his true friend, and without Renton there, he fell apart, and with him falling apart, the whole group dissipated. But he is the character that each of the group seem to still relate to in one way or the other. Absolutely marvelous to see how that character got really developed and grew over T2. The pair of films are held in high regard for me due to their direct connectivity to my own life, but they are just both great examples of taking themes of the time and representing them in a stylish manner on screen. And I think it's a testament to Danny Boyle's directorial career that he more or less started with one of them, and is one of his most recent is the other one, and they both reflect completely different tones. Absolutely marvelous films.
There's always been discussion of a third Trainspotting film. It was suggested from a story by Irving Welsh, the Blade artist, that there might be a spin-off centered around the character of Begbie. Irving Welsh has also hinted that a Trainspotting television series is possible. I think it's time to put those characters to bed and leave them in your memory. But what a memory, and what a great pair of films, but what an utterly defining film of an era.
Over on Twitter, follow us at FilmFile UK. On Instagram, FilmFile UK, to which I must apologise to anyone who follows us on Instagram for the picture of me with the Eurovision moniker above me at the weekend. I get very excited that time of year. Or you can email us, podcast@filmfile.uk. No, seriously, I love Eurovision. I must state that right now. I absolutely
I know you did. I
adore
was so
Eurovision.
surprised.
I have watched it every year for the past few decades. It's a great night. Anyway, let's get back to films, shall we?
Yes, indeed. So hopefully in a week or so, we will be going back into the cinema and bringing you a review. But in the meantime, we're going to give you another deep dive. And this week's deep dive is, and I can't find my notes, and I can't remember what the deep dive is.
High Fidelity.
Yeah, it is. Why can't I keep remembering High Fidelity? And I love it.
It's what that you suggested.
I know, because I
And
keep going.
next week's one of yours again. Alien next week. I'm looking forward to revisiting Alien.
I tell you what, watch Near Dark over the weekend. God, I love that film.
I've not seen that since. Oof.
If you can't find it, I've got it on DVD, so I'll drop it off.
I'll let you know if I struggle to find it.
Okay.
But I've added that on. That's going to be episode 79, Near Dark, which comes the week after we cover The Thing. Oh,
I can't wait. I want everything. Anyway, so get to my neat thing, and I'll give you. There'll be something about The Thing in that.
Cool.
And it came out in 2000. We'll be delivering. Hang on, I'll do something else. We'll be queuing. So go back to the giving you a deep dive. This week's deep dive that we are queuing up is the 2000 romantic comedy of type. I'll start again. This week's deep dive that we are queuing up is a romantic comedy of sorts. To every middle-aged man, this film is probably so important because it's an aspect of our life. It's the John Cusack starring Stephen Frears 2000 film, High Fidelity.
I will now sell 5 copies of the three EPs by the Beta Band.
You know what? I actually got into I never got into them. There was one Beta Band track. I think it was on the soundtrack. Was fantastic.
Dry the Rain. It's a marvelous track.
Yeah, that's right. A Scottish band, weren't they?
Yeah.
Okay, coming back in. High Fidelity came out in 2000 and could be classed as a romantic comedy drama. It starred John Cusack, Ivan Edgley, a very young Jack Black, and Lisa Bonet, and it was based on the 1995 British novel of the same name by author Nick Hornby. Many were surprised that the film was transplanted from London into Chicago. However, the film works beautifully, because what it doesn't do is it doesn't lose the essence of the story. And this was John Cusack, as probably his most charming. For anybody who grew up with John Cusack through, what was it? Say anything. If anybody who grew up with John Cusack through films like Say Anything, you know that he could turn it on, and he certainly does in this film. One of my favorites, with a great soundtrack based on a great book. This is one of those that hits the right groove all the time.
Cusack as Rob Gordon, the music lover who owns a record shop, is engaging us, the audience, with his fourth wall breaking moments, because we meet him just as he's going through a breakup, and thus begins an exploration into his top 5 breakups, which involves him tracking them down to try to find resolution to all his disastrous relationships. All of this is interrelated with the day-to-day activities of the record store he works in, with his employees Dick, played by Todd Luiso, and Barry, Jack Black, and also his encounters with a local musician, Lisa Bonet, as Marie DeSalle, as well as various other characters who frequent the record shop. It's comical, it's engaging, and Cusack is on his finest form. I know that he's done some great outings throughout his career, but this is the pinnacle for me of Cusack's utter engaging charm. The film itself is snappy, engaging. It definitely aided immensely by everyone involved. Jack Black had had many support roles up until this, but this was the film that put him on the radar, and indeed saw him then become a leading man status for the early part of the century, with a wild array of zany, wacky characters. Absolutely brilliant. I love it. Was Jack Black's energy in this film that initially grabbed me when I first saw it, as much as I enjoyed John Cusack. But it's over rewatching it, it's Cusack who has completely took the lead. And maybe that's part of, as I've got older, I've related more and more, like you said at the start of it, to the fact it's approaching a midlife crisis kind of a man. And I start to recognize the looking back and reflecting on mistakes that you may have made and opportunities you may have missed, whilst being obsessed with collecting vinyl records or other memorabilia.
One of the ways that this film really, really lands is the fact that they're not afraid by moving it from London to Chicago, which works really, really well in the film, but they keep the
It does.
essence of the Rob Gordon character in place at all times. He feels like the Rob Gordon from the book, and that's something that Cusack recognized and has a real affinity to the book that he brought to the film. He worked on the script. He brought in his usual producing partners to helm the film. Mike Newell was originally slated to direct, with a script by Con Air scriptwriter Scott Rosenberg, but when Cusack got involved, he turned it into he's almost his joint, and that shows there's a love affair with the book that transfers beautifully to the screen in the screen version. And for people our age, and I'm not going to say how old we are, the idea of record shops being this holy place and having your albums in alphabetical order or genre order, it just spoke to me. When I read the book the first time, I recognized so many elements of not only myself but mates as well. I like Cusack, saw myself in Rob Gordon, and it has that uniquely universal appeal. Sorry, it has that uniquely universal appeal to guys, or certain guys of a certain age, in the same way to some extent that uh, Nick Hornby's book about football spoke to friends of mine who were into football and recognized those characters. It works in a way that it's vibrant. It works in a way that it's vibrant. It feels honest. The breaking of the fourth wall reminds me a little bit of Alfie, Michael Caine's movie, but I just think there's just a charm to it that makes it, as all good romantic comedies or all good films be, makes it kind of timeless. I think anything that dates it is the ideas of record shops.
Uh, there are, with the rewatch this week, I did pick up some small issues with the film, and it's more because the era that we're living in has opened our eyes to quite a few things. The character of Rob has become slightly more, well, shall we say, self-centered and a bit of a dick when you look at it in fresh eyes these days. His attitudes towards his staff, his disregard for any attempts at friendship, and his insistence that all his past issues are because other people are against him. The worst example being when he's tracking down the exes to resolve things. There's the one who wouldn't put out, and he expresses his anger in a question to her as to why she did for her next boyfriend after him. And as she recounts how she never wanted to, but it wasn't actually rape, but he basically takes that as a win and more or less cheers. And it's like, oh, it left me feeling a bit uncomfortable in this day and age. But I think the important thing is we're not supposed to actually see him as a great person. We're supposed to see him as being self-absorbed, self-centered, and he doesn't realize what people are, what his actions are doing to the people around him. But over the journey of the film, he grows to realize that. And by the end of it, he's not a better person yet, but he's taking the first steps to become a better person. This is about acknowledging your past mistakes, or possibly your past mistakes and no one else's fault but your own.
I
And
totally
that
agree with
was a
you.
take that was a take that I hadn't taken from the film up until this most recent rewatch.
I'll totally agree with you on that, Andy. And I think that's the interesting thing about Rob Gordon. And that's why we appreciated the character and liked him at the time, because he wasn't. We were more like Rob Gordon than we were some other leading man. We have all those flaws. As a guy and going through dating, we've made some serious mistakes. I'm not just talking about myself, I'm talking about us as a gender who grew up in that period. But why it really, really works is that he's fallible, but he's got all the loves that we've all got. He makes a list about the kind of music he loves. He has mixtapes. It's that was us, and we've all been, to quote your term, we've all been dicks at some time.
You can't mention this film without mentioning the glorious soundtrack. The music, it's set in a record store, so obviously it was going to have some amazing needle drops. And boy, this is a soundtrack that I still listen to a lot of the artists today. And indeed, it introduced me to a few artists. You got Stiff Little Fingers are in there, Katrina and the Waves. But this film introduced me to the Beta Band. Thanks, amusingly, to the I will now sell 5 copies of the 3 EPs by the Beta Band line, which, yep, as soon as that film finished, when I first watched it on the big screen, I went out and I tracked down a copy of the 3 EPs by the Beta Band, because Dry the Rain was such a track. And I was listening to it earlier this week before I watched this. And then I watched this, and I've listened to a load more Beta Bands since, because it reminded me how much I was drawn to that band purely because of a film. And that is perfect placement of music to be able to sell me a whole band that I'd never encountered. Absolutely marvelous. The music fits every aspect of the film from start to finish.
It's interesting because the film really does. I'll start that again. You've hit a good point, because I think what the film really reflects is this is the characters' music choices. Rob, Dick, and Barry, they were musical elites. They were snobs, and that shows in the choices of some of the bands on there. 13th Floor Elevators were on there. Love, Bob Dylan, the Beta Band, as you said, Elvis Costello. Stereolab was a band that I was quite into at the time. Velvet Underground. These are, again, this is the soundtrack that my friends were listening to. I was always a bit more rocky, but at that point when indie was again at its height, it was the perfect soundtrack. It's just a hugely enjoyable film that, yes, feels like it's about the era but yes, it's about the era that it was made. But there are so many elements which is we recognize ourselves as guys, and I still do. I still have my CDs in alphabetical order. I still have things in genre, like my Blu-rays and my games. Everything is kind of that guy thing of having them laid out in a certain way. Um, I felt it was about me. I felt it was my story on screen, and I've made those dick moves, and I've learned from it as well. I really, really love this film because it feels like a slice of my life.
In recent years, the story has been readapted for a very short lived gender-swapped TV series for Hulu, which is available in the UK on Stars on Amazon, which saw Zoe Kravitz play Rob. Kravitz being the daughter of Lisa Bonet, who was in the first film. The series switched around a few of the characters, but played the same approach. Rob is bad in relationships, just gone through a breakup. The first few episodes play very close to the film, primarily because both play very close to the book. And so initially some moments felt like carbon copies, but then halfway through the season, it did that thing where it starts taking side journeys and explores side characters more. One of the employees of the shop, Simon, has a whole episode devoted to his top 5 breakups. And Kravitz is magnificently engaging in the series with half-hour episodes that zip by, again with an eclectic range of music cues and a strong cast to keep it enticing. The show brought the tale up to date. The record shop is still a record shop because vinyl's back in, baby. But it builds playlists on Spotify as opposed to mixtapes being subtly introduced. The character of Rob is not as self-centered as the Cusack version. More a damaged, insecure, and very flawed person trying to get her life in gear. Sadly, the show got cancelled after one season, despite very strong critical acclaim, and all involved were hopeful for a chance to move into some new territory. Kravitz, as star and producer, is still very passionate about getting a second season through another network or something else. I only discovered the series literally over the past week. I watched the film High Fidelity and I thought, okay, let's see how the series compares. And I found that I loved it so much that it took me 2 days and I went through the whole season. It's a marvelous modern adaptation of it, but it never steps on the toes of the original film. It complements it beautifully by taking a slightly different approach on some of the aspects. Thoroughly recommend checking out both the film and the TV series to really see what can be done with this story. So much fun, great music, great cast across both, and so much hilarity. You can't forget the standout comedy moments. You can't forget more than anything else. And I've just forgotten his name. You can't forget more than anything else, Tim Robbins in his brief little
Yes, I
role.
forgot about Tim Robbins being in it.
As the upstairs neighbour who is dating Rob's ex. Absolutely brilliant. Brilliant film, brilliant series. Get on them.
Fantastic. That's High Fidelity. You can find it, I believe, on Stars on Disney+.